Okay, Scott Shortmeyer here with the Rest and Recovery Podcast, and we are in beautiful Boston at the Biohacking Congress event. This is the second one of this year, and with me is Dr. Nathan Bryan. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott, for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on. Like I was saying offline, caught the tail end of your presentation on nitric oxide, and so personally I've heard about it, but not that often.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's an under-discussed but critically important topic. So maybe define nitric oxide and the importance, and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. Well, I mean, you make a very good point. I mean, this is a molecule that's discovered more than 30 years ago, and still there's not a lot of people that know about it, or probably heard about it, but don't understand the true implications of nitric oxide. But it's a signaling molecule. I think it's probably one of the most important molecules produced in the body of humans. It controls circulation, it controls oxygen and nutrient delivery to every cell in the body. It's a neurotransmitter, and it's how our immune system fights off invading pathogens. So now we're finding that if you can't make nitric oxide, it's the number one reason for cardiovascular disease, basically every major age-related disease, and it puts you at risk for viral infections, including the coronavirus.
And it's amazing to me that, you talk about oxygen, you hear about CO2 all the time when it comes to energy production and cardiovascular and things of that nature, but why is NO so omitted from that dialogue?
Well, in 2015, it was discovered that nitric oxide is part of the cardiorespiratory cycle.
Okay.
So before that, it was thought you just pick up oxygen, you excrete CO2, but all that's dependent upon nitric oxide production. So now it's recognized that the cardiorespiratory cycle is a three-gas system. It's oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitric oxide.
Okay.
So without nitric oxide, you can't deliver oxygen to the periphery. And so part of the Bohr effect, or how we deliver oxygen in the periphery and pick up CO2, is dependent upon nitric oxide.
So it's kind of the glue.
It is. No, it's the signaling aspect of hemoglobin. So what we're finding now, especially over the past 2 years, is COVID patients, the people who get sick and die from COVID are the people who can't make nitric oxide. So what does that mean? It means when you're exposed, your body can elicit an immune response. The virus replicates, propagates throughout the body. You lose oxygen saturation, you go to the hospital, you get ventilated, and then you die. That's the typical event. And even if you put people on 100% oxygen, many times you can't improve their oxygen saturation.
Okay.
Because you're not correcting the lack of nitric oxide. So what we're finding now, if you restore nitric oxide production, you can improve oxygen saturation, even in COVID patients, and keep them out of the hospital, keep them off a mechanical vent. And if you can do that, you can keep people alive.
So how do you produce nitric oxide? What's that process?
Well, so it's naturally produced in the body. There's two ways the body makes it. One is through an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. That enzyme converts arginine to nitric oxide. So years ago, probably 20 years ago or more, there were a lot of so-called nitric oxide products that contain L-arginine. But the older we get, the less our body is able to convert arginine to nitric oxide. Okay. So that strategy has failed. In fact, giving arginine to a patient that's nitric oxide deficient is like putting gas in a car with a blown-up engine.
Okay.
Right? They're not out of fuel, right?
Yeah.
The engine's broken.
Right.
So arginine products typically don't do anything. So we have to recouple that enzyme and allow the body to then convert that normally. The other more interesting pathway, I think, is through diet. So green leafy vegetables that contain inorganic nitrate that's converted to nitrite and nitric oxide by bacteria in the body.
Okay.
So anything we do that disrupts the microbiome shuts down nitric oxide production, causes an increase in blood pressure, causes sexual dysfunction, and puts you at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease.
Sexual dysfunction as well, I guess, because it's blood flow related, right? It's all blood flow.
Yeah, so it's every single chronic disease the hallmarks of every single chronic disease is decreased blood flow. So if you have decreased blood flow to the brain, you develop neurological conditions or loss of cognition. If you develop decreased blood flow to the heart, you develop heart disease. Decreased blood flow to the sex organs, you develop sexual dysfunction. Okay. So you have to be able to make nitric oxide, which then dilates the blood vessels, especially in the sex organs, which causes engorgement, and that's what causes an erection. Okay. So if you can't get increased blood flow because you can't make nitric oxide, you don't get an erection, and that's in both men and women.
So is there something that causes a depletion in the body throughout life?
Well, there's an age-related decline in nitric oxide production. So it's similar to growth hormone, testosterone hormones. Just the older we get, the less we make. Yeah. But we now know how to overcome that. So it's exposure to things like a poor diet, a high glycemic diet that glycates the enzyme, uncouples it, renders it dysfunctional. There's clear evidence now that glyphosate, the Roundup found in most crops grown in the U.S., shut down nitric oxide production. EMF frequencies of certain, 5G disrupts the nitric oxide production.
Okay.
So really a lot of the things we're exposed to shut down nitric oxide production.
Oh, wow.
And things like mouthwash kill the oral microbiome, shut down nitric oxide production. Fluoride in your toothpaste is an antiseptic, kills the bacteria, you become nitric oxide deficient. So everything that most Americans are doing are causing a disruption in nitric oxide production.
Okay.
And so to me, it's no wonder we have the sickest population on Earth.
Yeah, and you can almost explain, like you said, the last 2 years, why we had probably globally one of the worst effects from it. And you compare that to other areas that didn't have it as much,
Right.
and you can look at the diet, it seemed like.
Yeah, so what we're finding is that the patients who get sick and die from COVID are elderly, 50 to 85, African American, Hispanic, with at least one underlying comorbidity, whether
Okay.
that's high blood pressure, previous heart attack, diabetes, obesity, or smokers. Those are the highest risk patients. 98, 99% of the people that get COVID typically recover, mild symptoms, and move on.
Okay.
So there are at-risk patients. I mean, same with seasonal flu, even
Sure.
pre-COVID. The same people that get sick and die from COVID are the exact same people that get sick and die from the seasonal flu.
Okay.
And it all points to a lack of nitric oxide production.
So what are the strategies to kind of reclaim that, or how do you do that, especially at scale when you also hear about, you mentioned the different diseases, it's like 50% of the population,
That's
and
right.
you hear some of these other things around metabolic dysfunction as well. I'm sure there's a correlation. How do we hedge against that?
Well, I tell people you have to do two things. Stop doing the things that disrupt nitric oxide production, and then start doing the things that's clinically proven to restore it. So stop using mouthwash. There's 200 million Americans that wake up every morning and use mouthwash. 200 million Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. It's not coincidence, it's causal.
Wow.
So the other thing is fluoride. If you use fluoride in your toothpaste or you go to the dentist and get a fluoride rinse, you have to stop. Fluoride's a neurotoxin, it's an antiseptic, and it kills your thyroid function. So you have to remove fluoride. The other problem is it's in municipal water. So the water we drink, cook in, bathe in is fluorinated. So I tell people you have to get a home filtration system to remove the fluoride.
Okay.
And then, stop smoking. If you're on antacids, you have to get off antacids. Antacids shut down nitric oxide production. So those are the three main things that you have to stop doing.
Okay.
In fact, that saves people money, right?
Yeah,
It's
it
not
would.
asking a lot.
Well, and there's some of them are, like you said, almost free or will save you money. Stop brushing your teeth, or not stop brushing your teeth, but
Just get rid of
using
the fluoride.
the fluoride-based stuff.
So once you do that, the body will reward you with healing itself.
Okay.
And then now you just do things, moderate physical exercise, we have to move, that stimulates nitric oxide production. Throw in some more green leafy vegetables, that's your source of nitrate,
Okay.
that then the body converts into nitrite, nitric oxide. And then get some sunlight. The wavelengths of light and the frequency of light we get from the sun or even from red light therapy and infrared sauna produce nitric oxide. So it's really that simple. You stop doing the things that disrupt it, start doing the things that promote it.
Yeah, it's amazing how the world has been set up for our benefit, really. Just circadian rhythms, and you mentioned the sunlight and those simple things, and sometimes we can overcomplicate
That's right.
some of the things that are really the best for us.
Well, I think humans have the best intentions, the majority of us.
Yeah.
And so, we're taught these things, right? Fluoride was put in the mouthwash and toothpaste years ago, and when I ask people why they do that, well, it's just because it's the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
Right? So we know things now that we didn't know 50 years ago.
Right.
And if we don't act and correct those things that we now know are harmful and not beneficial, then we no longer have the excuse we do it, well, that's just the way we've done it.
Yep.
So that's called progress. But yeah, I think, it's very simple what we have to do. You have to, there's consequences to things people do, and if they don't recognize that and correct it, then they're going to continue down this spiral of poor health. We spend more money per capita than any nation in the world, and we have the sickest people.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's amazing to me the conversation piece isn't around nutrition and exercise and those simple tactics that we can do.
Well, that's very simple, but I think most Americans are program that they want a simple fix. Nobody wants to change their diet. Nobody wants to change their lifestyle. Nobody wants to put in the work. It's hard work to stay healthy.
It is.
But it's much cheaper. People have to make an investment in themselves. There's no greater asset that we have than our health.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to pay for it at some point, whether it's in the short term and you can amortize it and live longer and a higher quality life, or spend the last decade not feeling very good on all kinds of medications.
But this whole, the concept that there's a magic pill or some exercise mimetic that people can take and not have to do anything else is, that doesn't exist. Yeah. Nitric oxide's important, but it isn't a silver bullet. You still got to do the things and change the lifestyle and correct these behaviors that are contributing to your disease.
Yeah, I think I came to the conclusion recently that success is boring. Really, it's the little things that you do on a consistent basis.
Yeah, it's the turtle and the hare, right?
Right.
I mean, it's the slow consistency that leads to the wins.
Yep.
And I think most Americans want immediate gratification, and if you've been sick and unhealthy for 10 years, you're not going to turn this around in a period of days or weeks.
Yeah.
It's hard work, but for me, it's easier to prevent disease than it is to cure it. True. So once we get, and that's the problem with the way medicine's practiced in the U.S., is it's a reactive practice. So people don't go to the doctor or take corrective actions until they're sick. Right. We have to be proactive. We have to. The amount of information and the evolution of science is faster than any pace in the history of the world. So now we have to take that. That's the beauty of the Biohacking Congress. You bring all these people together and learn these simple tricks that then you can implement, most of the times very simply and easily, that you can prevent disease. And that's the whole basis of what we're trying to do.
So what's your thought on that last mile, I'll call it, of the human behavior element to try and get that transformation at scale?
Well, it's a slow process, and I think people want immediate gratification, and that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But we're up against a lot of resistance. So the pressures to feed a growing planet has led to nutrient depletion in the soil. So the farming practices to mass produce the food to feed a growing planet, and there's clear evidence now that since 1941 to 2020, there's 78% depletion in all minerals and nutrients in the food we grow in the U.S.
Yeah, it's amazing. You're just as full, but you're getting less of the nutrients.
Yeah, so we almost have to supplement. And I think the best way to do that is, there's labs out there, you can do a micronutrient analysis, go get it done, see what your body's missing, and then you have to supplement because we're not getting what we need from the diet.
So around the supplementation, you talked in your speech on some different methodologies to kind of ingest it other than nutrition. Is there a particular methodology, protocol, optimal approach to get it in a supplemental form?
Sure. So once we understood how the human body makes nitric oxide and then what goes wrong in people that can't make it, then we employ strategies to overcome that. So we now know that most Americans are deficient in nitrate in the diet, so we can supplement a standardized amount of nitrate that the body's missing. So if you're deficient in magnesium, what do? You take magnesium. If you're deficient in vitamin D, what do? You take vitamin D, right?
Right.
If you're deficient in nitrate, which most people are, you take nitrate. But then we also have to fix the enzyme that produces nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessel.
Okay.
So we have technology that does that in the form of an orally disintegrating tablet. So this matrix falls apart, you put it in your mouth, it takes about 5 to 6 minutes to dissolve. But during that 5 to 6 minutes, we're generating nitric oxide gas.
Okay.
So if your body can't make it, we do it for you. And then we also improve the body's ability to make nitric oxide. So we recouple the NOS enzyme, lead to better endothelial function, better circulation, better management of blood pressure, all through this orally disintegrating tablet.
So what's the expectation on the person who uses it? Like what should I feel if I consume that?
Well, I think we're probably the anomaly, right? We're somewhat healthy despite our advanced age. So if you're healthy and you make nitric oxide, you don't feel anything. So I don't feel it.
Okay.
Unless I exert myself. So if I, for instance, go to the gym and I do a typical, routine every time I work out, 2 to 3 miles on the treadmill, then resistance training, and then I go sit in a sauna. But if I don't take nitric oxide prior to that, then the perceived exertion of that same regimen is much greater.
Okay.
So then if you push yourself, you can notice the difference. But if you're really sick and really unhealthy, if you have, emphysema, COPD, high blood pressure. When you take that nitric oxide, you're going to notice it. People
Really?
feel it. Yeah.
Can that help folks with maybe asthma and other, I guess COPD would be corollary?
Absolutely. We have to train those. So nitric oxide is a gas.
Mm-hmm.
So when that lozenge is dissolving, we try to train people to breathe deeply, nasal breathing, deliver that nitric oxide that's being generated in the mouth directly to the airways.
Okay.
So it's a bronchodilator as well as a vasodilator.
Okay.
So you improve oxygen exchange, you open up the bronchioles, better perfuse the lungs, better oxygenate the blood, and you get better oxygen delivery to every cell in the body.
Okay. Can we go back a little bit? You mentioned nitrite and nitrate. Yeah. Can you explain those two a little bit more in detail?
So when nitric oxide is produced in the body, it's gone in less than a second. So it has a half-life of less than a second. So
Okay.
it's oxidized to nitrite and nitrate. Historically, nitrite and nitrate have gotten bad rap because that's how you cure meat, right?
Right.
Cured and processed meats. You add sodium nitrite or potassium nitrate to the meat. And that prevents bacterial spoilage, it prevents, it extends shelf life, prevents lipid oxidation,
Okay.
and it's critically important for food safety. So I guess dating back to the 50s and 60s, there was evidence that nitrosamines in cured meat were causing cancer. So then the nutritional epidemiologist goes, okay, what is the biologically plausible mechanism? Well, you add nitrite to cured and processed meats. If there's low molecular weight amines in there, they can form nitrosamines, and nitrosamines cause cancer.
Okay.
But now we know, and since 1973, the U.S. government changed the Code of Federal Regulations that any meat product or any food product you added nitrite, you had to add ascorbic acid.
Okay.
Because that inhibits any nitrosative chemistry. Now the meat processors use erythrobate, which is an isoform of ascorbate, and it prevents the nitrosative chemistry.
Okay.
So now, since 1970s, there's been no preformed nitrosamines in any of the meat supply. And two, if nitrite and nitrate cause cancer, then vegetarians would have about a 10-time higher rate of cancer than meat eaters. Because 85% of the nitrite we get from our diet comes from vegetables.
Yeah.
Only 5% comes from cured and processed meats.
Okay.
The other 10% comes from swallowing our own saliva.
Wait, run that by.
So when our body makes nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessels,
Yeah.
it's oxidized to nitrate.
Okay.
And then that nitrate is concentrated in our salivary glands. So now each time we salivate, nitrate is secreted in our mouth.
Really?
And then there are nitrate-reducing bacteria that live on the crypts of the tongue that reduce nitrate to nitrite. So now every time we swallow our saliva, nitrite becomes protonated in the acid environment of the stomach. We generate nitric oxide gas, and that basically improves circulation, improves gastric mucosal blood flow, you enhance nutrient absorption, prevent foodborne illnesses like from E. coli or salmonella.
Okay.
Kills H. pylori, the ulcer-causing bacteria. So that's the 10% so that's a fundamental physiological process that's necessary to maintain normal blood pressure and to prevent any foodborne illness.
So you're making me think of something, but work with me on the question. Yeah. So does that correlate with nitric oxide process and bacteria in your mouth and your gut? Is there a connection to that?
No, so we published on this years ago that if you disrupt the oral microbiome, it causes an increase in blood pressure. And this is a completely new phenomenon in cardiovascular science, right? That the bacteria that live in our mouth are controlling our systemic blood pressure. So so humans don't have a nitrate reductase enzyme. So
Okay.
everything we do in terms of diet is dependent upon the microbiome. So if we're using mouthwash, which 200 million Americans wake up every day to use mouthwash, 200 million Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. If you disrupt this microbiome, it disrupts nitric oxide production, causes an increase in blood pressure, causes sexual dysfunction, and you lose the protective benefits of exercise. So if you use mouthwash, then go for a 2 to 3 mile run or go to the gym, you don't get any protective benefits of exercise.
So it's nulling it,
It's
basically
nulling
wiping it out.
You're just as good of doing nothing if you're using mouthwash.
What?
Yeah,
That
I was
sounds
on
insane.
Yeah, no, I was on the doctor show last year when we made that observation. That if you use mouthwash, you lose the benefits of exercise. And it's a nitric oxide related phenomenon.
Is it because it's killing the bacteria in
That's
your
right.
mouth?
So this whole hygiene hypothesis to disease is valid, right? So 200 million prescriptions written for antibiotics every year. We now know the effects of antibiotics on the GI microbiome and it causes a lot of human disease. So we know not to take an antibiotic every day, so why would you use a mouthwash every day?
Right.
You're causing not only oral dysbiosis, you're causing gut dysbiosis. You're shutting down nitric oxide production, and loss of nitric oxide is causal for the #1 killer of men and women worldwide, which is cardiovascular disease.
So could that correlate to some mystery diseases like chronic fatigue? Could there be some correlation or connection to that?
No doubt. I mean, chronic fatigue is basically, it's a mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondria produce cellular energy. Nitric oxide is what controls mitochondrial biogenesis. Nitric oxide controls ATP production and oxygen utilization to make ATP. So if you can't make nitric oxide, you have less mitochondria producing less energy, even though you have sufficient oxygen.
Yeah.
So that explains chronic fatigue, it explains cancer, it explains every age-related chronic disease from Alzheimer's, diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Wow.
Even a lot of autoimmunity.
That's amazing to me. So you mentioned blood pressure. Can you kind of expand, and maybe you touched on it already, but how consuming these products can help with the blood pressure piece of it? Because that's another big issue with society.
Yeah, I mean, it's the #1 modifiable risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So nitric oxide is a vasodilator, meaning when it's produced, it causes the blood vessels to dilate and expand.
Okay.
So we have typically the same amount of volume all the time. So you have the same amount of volume in a smaller pipe, you develop high blood pressure. Get that same volume, but the blood vessels are more dilated, then you have lower pressure.
Okay.
So nitric oxide is what causes the vasodilation. So if our body generates nitric oxide, or if our body can't make nitric oxide, then we don't get the dilation, we get constricted blood vessels, that causes an increase in blood pressure.
Okay.
But it's more than that. Then you get, if you have an increase in blood pressure, you get inflammation, you cause damage to the lining of the blood vessel, you get oxidative stress and immune dysfunction.
Is it because, so the blood vessels, is it because you're trying to put too much down the smaller hose, and it's like almost
That's right.
like forcing it through?
It's pressure. So like a water hose, if you've got a weak spot in the water hose, you increase the pressure, you put your thumb on it, you'll see that bulge.
So you're almost kind of increasing friction in
so you can cause an aneurysm, you get blood vessels that rupture. You're seeing that now in chronic COVID patients, that the microemboli, the platelets become aggregated, they develop blood clots. It explains the cardiomyopathies and the endocarditis from COVID or even from the mRNA vaccine. So all of that nitric oxide maintains normal blood pressure, prevents vascular inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction.
Gosh, there's so many things, and it seems like such a simple, not
It's
a
a very
simple fix, but
well, it's a
simple
very-
but long-term fix.
It's a very complicated, complex science, but the effects are very clear. There are over 185,000 scientific papers published on nitric oxide. So the evidence is clear. Now, so it's not lack of information or knowledge, it's the dissemination of that information and knowledge
And the
to not
application.
just consumers, but to physicians. Physicians need to understand nitric oxide deficiency, symptoms in their patients, and then employ strategies to restore them.
I mean, is that a long-term game, the PR campaign that's needed basically as well?
It is, and we've been very successful in the nutrition dietary supplement space, but we have a number of drugs that are going through FDA trials, and I think we'll gain more awareness and acceptance of this when a physician can actually write a prescription for a nitric oxide medication to overcome some problem in their patients. So today in Western medicine, physicians typically don't, they always tell you change your diet, exercise more, but nobody does that, right? And most physicians don't recommend supplements or nutritional products.
Sure.
So their model is write a script, go to the pharmacy, fill it, take this pill. And I think once we have safe and effective nitric oxide drugs on the market, then the awareness will become more and there'll be better adoption from consumers.
Okay.
So our approach was we have to first educate the physicians. But that's a very tall task. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, right?
Exactly.
So we thought, okay, now we got to educate the consumers so that the patients can go to their physician, ask the right questions, and then force the docs now to do the research, because there's nothing more embarrassing than a patient to ask you a question you don't understand,
Right.
you don't have the answer to.
So does it make sense to start with maybe the next generation of doctors that try and get into the medical systems and the schoolings?
We've tried to change the curriculum. I was in academia for almost 20 years.
Okay.
And I taught at medical schools, taught future physicians, And the curriculum, is very resistant to change the curriculum. There's no nutrition courses taught in medical school. We tried to teach, and the curriculum is such that you learn biochemistry and physiology the first year. Second year, you learn pharmacology. And then in your clinicals, you learn diagnostic, you learn ICD-10 codes, reimbursement, and they forget everything they learned about biochemistry and physiology. Because now the pay model is you have to make a diagnosis. Once you make a diagnosis, you have a finite number of things you can do in terms of prescribing medication, and then you have to code that for reimbursement. So there's no pressures to learn to understand the biochemistry and physiology, because it's just prescribing a drug that really does nothing to the underlying etiology of disease.
Yeah, and it seems too, through my personal investigation, that a lot of these things that can be the good intentions misapplied in pharmacology also have some other depleting aspects to a lot of the drugs as well.
Well, there's no drug that's without side effects. I mean, most drugs are inhibitors of certain enzymes, right? And so when you inhibit an enzyme system, there are always consequences to that.
Yeah.
And so all drugs have side effects. What we do is different. We're not inhibiting any enzyme. We're basically giving back the body what's missing.
So it's working with the natural order of things.
We call it restorative physiology.
Okay.
So it's not pharmacology. It's restorative physiology. We're giving the body something that is missing, that it naturally makes, and then improving the body's own ability to make it. So that's completely different. And in fact, in our drug studies, we haven't had any reports of any adverse events. Because we're giving the body what it's used to seeing and naturally producing the right amount at the right time.
That's huge, and I think that's an important aspect to work with the body, work with the system.
That's right.
As we continue to unpack it, because there's so many layers that we're only still just learning about and per this conversation, really.
Yeah, I think what I've learned, besides a lot about nitric oxide, is that human disease is caused by two things and two things only. And it doesn't matter if it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, sexual dysfunction. The body's missing something that it needs, or it's exposed to something it doesn't need. So we now know from Linus Pauling's work that most chronic disease is caused from nutrient deficiencies. We know that the food we eat is missing certain nutrients. So if we supplement what's missing and we get rid of the toxins in our body, or remove ourselves from a source of exposure of a toxin, then the body heals itself. That's how we're designed.
Yeah. We're
regenerative beings, and we just got to get out of the way. Let the body do what it's designed to do.
So before we wrap up, is there one thing that I haven't touched on yet that you think is an important point to make around this topic?
Well, I think what the science is clear. Your body cannot and will not heal or perform optimally without nitric oxide. So if there's one thing I ask you to do, it's like do some research, understand the importance of nitric oxide, and then just do these simple things. Stop using mouthwash, get rid of fluoride, stop using antacids, exercise, get some sunlight, and when all else fails, take a nitric oxide supplement.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your insights. If you haven't had a chance to check out Dr. Bryan's presentation, I would encourage you to do so. He digs deep into a lot of what we discussed today. So thank you so much, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you, Scott.
Joining me.
Pleasure.
Thanks.